Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Welcome to ACM. My name is Malvika Agarwal. I'm curator for South Asia at the ACM and your host for this evening. I would like to welcome you to ACM Conversations. ACM Conversations is a series of monthly talks that brings together leading scholars, cultural practitioners, artisans, and community resource persons in Singapore and from abroad in conversation with curators and educators at ACM. This talk series would not have been possible without the generous support of Dalio Philanthropies. It is my pleasure to introduce you today to our speaker, Donald M. Stadtner. Don received his PhD in Indian art from the University of California, Berkeley, and was for many years an associate professor at the University of Texas, Austin. He is the author of Ancient Pagan, 2005, and Sacred Sites of Burma, published in 2011, and co-editor of the exhibition catalog for Buddhist Art of Myanmar 2015. His new book, which we have a copy right here, Sacred Sites of Sri Lanka, if anybody would like to buy it, which we don't have today, but you'll have to look out for the website, I guess, which John can tell you more about, was published in late 2024. His articles have appeared in Ars Orientalis, Artibus Asiae, Journal of the Siam Society, Orientations and Arts of Asia. He divides his time between San Francisco and research trips to Southeast Asia and India. Today, he will be speaking about the interpretations of Sripada, a stone footprint believed to have been left by the Buddha and venerated by people of diverse faiths. Please join me in welcoming Donald to the stage to begin his talk.
Well, coming over here on the taxi, the first thing the guy said, "Why are you going to the museum?" And I said, "Well, I'm giving a talk." And then he said, "How old are you? You're still giving a talk?" Anyway, okay, the verse 2. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get right to it. And I need your help now. Look carefully at this banana that I sliced in my kitchen last week. Do you see a man crucified? No? Well, it was this man from the 14th century, an Italian Franciscan monk who came to Sri Lanka, cut open a banana, and saw a crucifixion. So at this point, I want you to abandon all of your scientific rationale and jump back to the 14th century when people really believed in Adam and Eve and that we were created in God's image or whatever it was in 7 days the earth came to being. So if you can, it'll help you understand the sacred sites of any country if you can jump back into that way of thinking. Because if you approach it from a modern AI perspective or whatever, you'll miss it. So the next, and we'll see this papal envoy who came all the way from Avignon, who was visiting the Khans, there it is, and then he landed in Sri Lanka, and lo and behold, he said, "This is not any old place. This is the Garden of Eden," from not only the Bible, but we'll see from the Islamic Quran, which also has this virtually identical traditions. And the next, now it all comes back to Sripada, which is the Pali word for sacred footstep, pada, the foot, feet. And it starts there because it was from here that he believed that this foot was not from the Buddha, but from our first ancestor, Adam. And so we'll see how, partly this talk is about how did people come up with all of these incredible variations from the Buddha to Adam in the Old Testament. And so we'll see in the 14th century, and we'll trace the evolution of thought in connection with this footstep. And the next. And so here is the footstep itself. And then from here, the monk, go back one, please. There. And that's perfect. And so imagine yourself in the Muslim world with all of these ideas about Adam and Eve and Eden, the paradise, in the Quran itself. But where were these places? And so with Arab traders in just before the beginning of the second millennium, in 800, 900 AD, they find this tropical island and they hear, oh my God, there's this sacred footstep. And they assumed, who else could be making this sacred footstep apart from Adam? And so that is the beginning of the Christian idea that that the footstep is associated with Adam and not the Buddha. And remember, at this point in the historical periods, there was such a limited misinformation about Buddhism. There was no Google that you could go to. So you say, oh, the Buddha's this, the Buddha's that. This was all new to them, completely new. And so there was this multiple layers of misinterpretation at the time. Now, with the passage of time, the next, by the early second millennium, Arab and Muslim geographers, Sri Lanka was on the map as Adam's Peak, identified by the geographers with this place associated with Adam and Eve. And the next. But for Buddhists, it was always the Buddha's footprint, Sri Lanka, begun as early as the 5th century, as we'll see. So there's no doubt that the Buddhists had the first claim to this depression in stone. That's unequivocal. And it begins, the next, as early as the 5th century. And you can see another part of what was so dramatic about Adam's Peak is that you could see it from the ocean. And so these Arab Muslim traders and merchants, when they were sailing into Colombo, the capital today, they could see this mountain. And they were familiar with all these legends of a sacred footstep. And the next. So a major point tonight is the elasticity of myths and how they could be stretched in so many different directions. And we'll see theories, some quite crazy theories, how the footstep could be not only Adam's, but St. Thomas, and even an eunuch from Ethiopia. But we'll trace these and we'll see how all of these myths come together. The next. And to make this point, and there's a wonderful story in early Buddhist literature about the elephant and the blind men. The king requesting these wise but blind men to examine an elephant and to come back and tell them what's an elephant like. And of course, they were just touched. Whoops, I must have come back. And one touched the trunk, the other touched the back foot. They all came back to the king and described it, but from their own limited point of view. And so the king responded, "You crazy wise men, that's not an elephant." And so we'll see that the footprint, in some ways, is much like that elephant that is viewed from a very narrow perspective by each of these subsequent groups over the centuries. And the next. So historically, we'll see that we have first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then, of course, the English in this order. And the Adams Peak itself, whoops, I'm doing that. Let's see, whoops. Maybe I'd better stop using the pointer. So, no, okay, stopping that. Okay. So it's the Buddhist footprint, and you can very easily visit this easily. You can get there, but it's a long walk up, and it's a big, long walk up. Let me warn you, and I confess I've never tried it. But the next. But coming back to the object in question tonight, this is the box upstairs, this chest, which I urge you all to see. It's spectacular. And I was here 3 or 4 years ago, and before I started to study this whole problem, and I saw Adam and Eve, and I said, what on earth is Adam and Eve doing on this box from Sri Lanka? It was from the Dutch period, but it puzzled me. But then, a year or two later, the next, I was in Lisbon at the Museum of the Orient, and sure enough, the next, there was an almost identical box. And I said, wow, that's extraordinary. Obviously from the same workshop as our box upstairs. And the next, and then the next year, I was in Colombo at a former Dutch governor's mansion, which is a museum today. And guess what? The next, this tiny panel with obvious connections to these others that we've been examining. In this one, when we compare the two, the next, you can see the obvious differences, but it's basically drawn from the same model, as we can see. Now, there's some strange things. And does that look like a rhinoceros to you? And the Dutch, of course, were here and in Java and in Sumatra, where there were rhinoceros. And so possibly that is a motif that we'll see. And the next, or this little creature, which is, you can see the range for the pangolin. It's possible, just possible, that that is a pangolin. And the next, all of these had wood backings. You can't see it on this example upstairs because all of the panels are in pristine position, their original position. But the object in Colombo, you can see the wooden backing. And to connect these two. I'll try the pointer again. Oh, yeah. So to connect the two, in this example, there are ivory nails, if you can imagine that, little bits of ivory that connect the two. But in this example, it was repaired, and you can see the actual nails. This is that wooden background, which in most cases is teak. The next. And most of the commentary on these always cite this early work by Albert Dürer, but it's much earlier, by 100 years or more, and it's a woodcut. And I think that's probably oversimplifying the connection between this composition. There's no river, for example, that is so prominent in these other examples from Sri Lanka. But there are other discorrespondences, so to speak. And the next, and the river, which occupies a big part of this composition, is nowhere in sight in these other depictions of Adam and Eve in Europe. But the river in Genesis, the next, there are four rivers that come from the Garden of Eden. There's a spring. This is the garden. There's a spring, and if this was in, these are the four rivers that are mentioned in Genesis, and we'll see that from Adam's Peak, from this region, there are actually four of the major rivers in Sri Lanka. And so to Europeans, especially to that early Italian, wow, four rivers in Genesis, four rivers here. It was yet one more reason for early Europeans to make this connection with Adam's Peak and with the Old Testament Eden. And the next. And so more boxes turned up. I kept looking for them. And here in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you can very immediately see that it's basically the same composition. And I suspect that this one, which is much larger, you see the full elephant as opposed to this little guy, a horse here, and God knows what this is. And it's obviously a much larger composition, literally and figuratively. And I suspect that there were copper plate engravings that the artists used. And I suspect, too, that this would have been the large model from which these were executed. The next. And then if you're wondering how much these cost, I found this from Sotheby's, and for a mere 60,000 British pounds, this could be on your kitchen table. So from 2011. But you can see the compositions are the same, the larger ones, and these unusual, maybe this is that rhinoceros, we're not sure. But I've never really personally studied these enough to make these kind of conclusions. These are all speculations. The next. And from Sotheby's, and this little red square is what I imagine that original copperplate engraving was. And the next. And then lo and behold, from the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, it's basically again the same. And I'm sure we're looking just at the tip of the iceberg. There are probably dozens of these things that were made originally, and they were probably for export. Some of the best ivories went to royal courts in Europe, but I'm sure many of these were just for wealthy people, both in Sri Lanka and in Europe. But the question remains, and these examples emphasize this: why Adam and Eve? And remember the Dutch, and remember the warfare between the Dutch and the Portuguese that played itself out in nearby Malacca. They were all Christians, but they hated each other, and each called the other heretics in the literature. And so we'll see what the Portuguese thought that foot was and what the Dutch thought it was. And that's probably one of the main reasons that we have this dichotomy in interpretation. The next, and was it really Adam's footprint? The next, and where did it really come? Well, our Franciscan in the 14th century, he posed that question to monks, Buddhist monks that he found at the site and all through Sri Lanka. Are you the sons of Adam and Eve? And of course they said, yes, of course we're the sons of Adam and Eve. And he wanted to hear that, and that's what he heard. And so for this papal envoy in the 14th century, that confirmed it, along with the four rivers and everything else. Oh, you're descendant from Adam and Eve. Um, Clearly, that was the determining factor. And the next, and not only that, they told him, oh, paradise, where's that? Oh, 40 miles that way. and so And so the die was cast for Europeans. The next. And it became such an object of interest and concern that the Dutch governor in the 18th century posed questions to senior monks. And one of the main questions was this the footprint of Adam? And of course, the monks at that time, and this is a whole different context, said, Adam? Who's Adam? This is the Buddha's footprint, you idiot. There was no doubt in their mind that it was the Buddha's footprint. And certainly they can claim the antiquity for that. There's no doubt about that. And the next. And European artists picked up the theme. And you can see very clearly, this is, guess what? This is the expulsion. No longer are they in this dream world of perfect weather. It's lightning striking. No longer do they need to go naked because they have no knowledge of this kind of thing. But guess what? These banana leaves. And we'll see how important the banana, that's why I started with the banana, is the banana was, remember, such an exotic fruit if you came from Italy, which at that time didn't even have the tomato. This was big, along with everything else, was very big. And so they covered themselves with the banana leaf. And this even appears in John Milton's Paradise Lost in the 17th century, the idea of the banana leaf. And the next, and you can see generations later by the same Dutch artist, not Adam and Eve, but their descendants. And it's still set in Asia. And so you can see the possibly papaya, no, banana plant and the palm, certainly setting this in an Asian context. And the next, and even Rembrandt, it got into this. It was a widely accepted notion that by this time, that Eden, the garden, was somewhere out there in the east. And so you see this detail from Rembrandt's drawing. You see the elephant. And the next, and the point is obvious. And the next. Now, where did this come from in Buddhism? From the 5th century AD, we have the god, the indigenous Sinhalese god, known as Sumana. And Sumana invited the Buddha. Remember, the Buddha visited Sri Lanka 3 times, in theory. 3 times came to Sri Lanka. And on the 3rd time, he met the god Sumana. He gave him hair relics, which are major stupas now in Sri Lanka, but he also gave him the footsteps. But this case, it's a completely indigenous concept. There's nothing in Buddhism about the sacred footstep on any mountain. And the deity Sumana, the next, this is a typical example of fabric, a painted fabric, with a priest associated with this temple. And there, in the background, in the distance, is Adam's Peak. And the next, there by the same mural painter from the 1930s in Sri Lanka, the Buddha with his 500 attendants and disciples coming down and placing his footstep onto the stone. You can see the mountain. You see how it's indicated here. And the next. Now, today it's a major pilgrimage site for Sri Lankans, and there are very few Sri Lankans that haven't made that climb. And you can see from the even early 20th century, it was a very simple affair. Very few people made that climb. And at that point, it was extremely arduous. Now we have this stepway going all the way up. But at one point, it could be hazardous. And there were people losing their lives attempting the climb. And now, instead of this very simple little pavilion, you can see there's not a place on the summit that hasn't been taken over by buildings. There's even a helioport for helicopters, for people, senators coming in for pujas and flying in and flying out. It's a completely different site at this point. And the next. And people frequently make the pilgrimage in the evening in order to appear the next. In the morning, there's a very peculiar shadow that exists. There's a whole special mythology and everything else associated with this shadow that looks like a pyramid. And the next. Now, once again, coming back to our papal envoy who discovered the Garden of Eden. And we'll see next. And now I think you can see the background to his discovery. And the next. And oh, go back. Yeah, and at this point, I'm in my kitchen. I got so confused. How can anybody see this? I said, "Oh, I cut the banana raw." So I sliced it lengthwise. So I sliced it lengthwise, thinking, "Oh, well, maybe I can see it." But I invite you to see any crucified man. But the mythology, the next, um, taken up by in the same century by a famous Arab traveler from Morocco named Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, who made this more or less the same journey that our friar from Avignon made, and who also stopped at there. And if the Franciscan could see a crucifixion in a banana, the next, so could Ibn Battuta in a rose could see the name written Muhammad and Allah. I mean, it's another example is you see what you want to see. And it's no less true today as it was then. We don't like to think so, but when we really evaluate our prejudices and our preconceived images, we have that. And the next. And where was the garden? In the Bible, in the Quran, unfortunately, it never specified. So this opened the floodgates to speculation. The next. Now, in general, a generalization, in Islam, the garden was in heaven, and Adam and Eve were cast down as a punishment. But in Christianity, in general, they were cast out. That Garden of Eden was on earth, and they were cast out onto the earth. So that once again opened up this perennial question in early Christianity. Where was this garden? And the next, back to our friend in the, you still can't see it, can you? No. Okay, the next. Now this led people to to name the banana. You see the Latin, the paradisica, see it? So Musa, which is an Arab word for banana, but paradisiaca, from paradise. That was one of the names Linnaeus gave it. The second name is even more probative, from Homo sapiens, which obviously relates to Adam, our first ancestor. So even the ancient name, the Homo sapiens, the paradisia, gives you some idea of how deep this notion was. And the next. And it wasn't just the banana. There were many different theories about what was that sacred, or not sacred fruit, but that delicious fruit that caused all this grief that we're still suffering from. And some people said the banana, the fig, and a special kind of citrus, the ponderosa lemon. And the next. And it also led to another sub-myth, with the Adam's apple in your throat. And so poor Adam, swallowing the apple after biting off too much, choked and died on the apple. And so this is the origin of our word, the Adam's apple in our throat. there's a medieval 15th century example of Adam now as a corpse. So you see him holding his throat. Right. Then the next. Now, Marco Polo got in the action. And here you see his route. And he also made a stab at analyzing the footprint. And so we'll see the next, and we'll see in a very rare depiction from a Burgundian manuscript in the 15th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it was his point that this isn't the Garden of Eden. This is this is Adam's tomb. Another complete fabrication, but one which we'll see had a lot of traction in the medieval period. And you see the two chains. We'll come back to that to help people. There was to help people climb up. Now, the most extraordinary thing is that he was one of the first to identify this, to identify the Buddha. And he gives the Buddha's name. It's a bastardized form, but it's clearly the Buddha's name. And he describes the Buddha's life. And so what we have, you all remember the story where his father spoiled the Buddha in the palace before he went out and saw the real horrible world? We all know that story. Well, what we see here is, believe it or not, in Burgundian outfit from the 15th century, that is the Shakyamuni Buddha with all his lovely maidens. Remember, his father gave him all these beautiful women to dissuade him from the spiritual course. And so that's what we see represented. Now, I had this medieval French translated, and so it's nothing I'm making up. It's a direct translation, a summation of this French text. And the next. Now, of all the theories, this has got to be the wildest. Queen Candace from Ethiopia, who was another semi-mythical character for the medieval world. And she was popular in the sense that she was married to Alexander the Great and had children with him, and all kinds of legends about Queen Candace. So one of them was, and she had a famous eunuch, here nameless eunuch, but a dark-skinned eunuch, and that from one thing to the next led to the notion, well, this could be the footprint of this eunuch. Yeah, it's really bizarre. But this was generally rejected by both the Portuguese and the Dutch. But you can see her, and then the Ethiopian Candace. She's had a whole life of her own. We'll see the next. This is possibly the real, genuine depiction of Queen Candace. But as I mentioned, she took on a personality all of her own. The next. I love this. It's just great. This is the new Candace. And the next. Now, the most popular theory after Adam is that the footprint belonged to one of the major disciples of Christ, Thomas. And Thomas, one of these disciples at the Last Supper, where did he go? They were all proselytizing, evangelizing, missionizing. And the next, and we'll see that he went to none other than southern India to Christianize the entire population. That's myth, but in Portuguese eyes, the Catholicism that they brought, the Portuguese brought to Asia, was on top of and followed the Christianity of St. Thomas. And so we'll see in the next, you can see his, and I was just thinking, they're probably, well, certainly Christians in South India who belong to this sect that treasure St. Thomas. And they're probably in Singapore. If you Google this or AI this, you can probably find, if you wanted to join, you could probably find a certain division of St. Thomas Christians, Indians from South India, that adhere to this notion that St. Thomas brought Christianity to India in the early centuries AD. And the next, we'll go to Mylapore, which is a suburb of Madras. And you can see the tomb and the modern 19th century church. And the next. And this became such an object of interest and importance for the Portuguese that there was an official examination of what was thought to be the footprint. And once again, like the banana, maybe the footprint, maybe the crucifixion, take your pick. And so it was thought in this official inquest in 1521 that there was a footprint and a knee mark where he knelt down when he was martyred, when these bad folks killed him. And also in Sri Lanka, there was also purportedly knee marks where the saint had knelt down to say prayers. All completely fictitious in many layers of in fiction, many layers, but wonderful in their own way. And the next. And so the first Western depiction, the earliest that we have, is from the 17th century, and it's Portuguese. And you can see the depiction, and I'll point out the chains that were used to climb. And remember with Adam and Eve, remember at this point, a partial legend that they were separated, that for their crime of eating the banana, they were separated. And so there's lots of legends, both in Islamic, began in Islamic literature. Eve crying, weeping. And what comes from weeping? Tears. And so where do the tears go? They go into these two lakes. They're two large ponds. And these were considered the receptacles of where Eve's tears landed up. And the next. And so you can see in many depictions in Sri Lanka. And then this is modern, but this, I've asked scientists about this. Can't this be tested, this chain? And there are many of them that were donated by pilgrims because it was an act of merit. And so these chains, and the scientists said, oh, I wish we could date these chains. And I suspect these are maybe 15th, 16th century. I have no idea. But they're chains associated with merit. And the next, There's a better example. These are the two lakes with the tears. And then if Adam and Eve lived in Sri Lanka, where did they go? Where were they buried? And the next, and you'll see the Adam's, this obviously is a reclining Buddha. Everybody knows that. You don't even have to go to AI to tell you that this is a reclining Buddha. But for the Dutch, it was Adam's tomb. And so this dichotomy that went on for centuries, but it was mostly had a political meaning and a political cultural meaning, because the Dutch, as Calvinists, were enamored with Adam, the story of Adam and Eve. And the Dutch, one thing they hated were saints. They didn't like saints. No saints in their churches. That was for Catholics. And remember, in 15th, 16th century Europe, this was warfare. This was a very important deal. And so I think ultimately this preference, one for Adam and Eve, one for St. Thomas, ultimately comes down to that. And the next. So, whose footprint? Shall we take a guess? It was obviously the Buddha's. He came centuries before these other theories. But everybody got into the action. And the next. And so when we see all of these alternatives, we inevitably come back to the next. Our friends are blind, wise men with the elephant. And so you can see that this evolving, ever evolving interpretations of the same stone footprint. Until the next, we come to good night. So, well, thank you very much for being so attentive. And we have plenty of time for discussion. I don't like to call it question and Q&A question. But yeah, right. Sure. Sure. And we have a microphone, so if you do have an observation, the microphone can be handed to you. Right. Yeah. Good. Good.
I first like to thank you, Don, for a very insightful and fun talk on a relatively, I think, unknown, piece of history. We do have some time for questions, but can I ask one of my own
Sure.
first? Which is that, once this sort of understanding or relabeling happened of Sripada to Adam's Peak, there was a pre-existing shrine, and it was a pilgrim site for Buddhists.
Right.
But did that functionally also become something that Christians went to, or did also
Well,
double up?
in the older days, it was Buddhist, and it was sorry, it was eclectic, and so there were Muslims even from India that came over regularly from the subcontinent to worship this, and there were Christians that did. But in the last 50 years, the Buddhist nationalists, if we can use that word, the Buddhist nationalists have have made it their own. And so Christians no longer feel comfortable there. Muslims no longer feel comfortable there. despite what the guidebooks tell you. The guidebooks, oh, it's one happy family and everybody worships there. It doesn't. And this is true for the majority of sites that were at one time pluralistic, that have been, we call it Sinicized, the Sinhala majority, the Buddhist Sinhala majority. And so for most of these sites, Kataragama was a purely Hindu site that was taken over that has been taken over by the Buddhists. And it's a major political, social issue today. Does that answer your?
It does. Thank you. And thank you for contextualizing it for the present as
Yeah.
well.
Has anybody walked up? Oh, excellent. What was your experience?
Well, it was a long way out, and it was very crowded, even on a rainy day, with people easily twice my age and in their bare feet.
Right.
Everyone from infants to people who were ancient, all kinds of people coming up and going down.
Going down. Right. And how long were you able to witness the footstep?
Only briefly, because it's police. It's a police, and they let you pass through, but very quickly you get a glimpse, and then you pass right through.
Right. I liken it to Lenin's tomb in Moscow. You just go by and do a little something. Right.
The actual footstep has been removed, and what's there that you look at is a replica.
As far as I know, it's the real footstep.
They removed the actual stone that was the print that was in the stone. It was removed and put into a safer place some years ago. Oh, not a long time ago. I couldn't get the exact date, but I'd say, sometime maybe 15 years ago.
Well, what you're probably thinking
then they
of.
have a replica of it that you look at, that you pass through very quickly.
That's the first I've heard this, but I'll ask. I'm going to Sri Lanka tomorrow, and I'll ask about this. But what you may be thinking of, there were replicas, metal replicas, that were placed over the stone. And maybe that's what you're thinking of. But I'd be surprised if it's not the original, because to carve out that stone would not be easy. Yeah. Any?
Okay. Yeah. Do we have any other questions in the audience for Don to answer?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the gentleman in the t-shirt, green t-shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Could you clarify who was it who was suggesting that that it might be Saint Thomas's footprint and the eunuch's footprint?
Sure. The Buddhist, of course, said it was the Buddhist footprint, unless in the 14th century, when that monk from Europe said, "Whose footprint?" And then these Buddhists said, "Oh, it's Adam's footprint," but that was completely misleading. But it became a general concept among the Portuguese. That one drawing from 1638 that I showed you, that particular one, the Portuguese I had translated for me, and it said, "This is the Buddha's, not the Buddha's, but the footprint of Saint Thomas." There's another part of the legend. If there was only one footprint, where's the other one? And there was another whole mythology that the second footprint, it could have been in Thailand, where there's an important footprint, near Bangkok in Saraburi, or somewhere on the southeastern coast of India. And moreover, not only was it the footprint, and this gets back to the Buddha, that the Buddha straddled. Remember, you take one footstep, you've got to keep the other foot down. And so this giant Buddha, one foot on Sri Lanka and the other foot, and you know that, and I'm not making this up, and I'm not trying to be crude, but one foot or disrespectful. Remember the waterway? They're separated, Sri Lanka, by a very tiny waterway. It's in my book, this was the Buddha urinating to create this. And so, but at that point, it was not considered derogatory. It was just a matter of fact. If there's a footprint and there's water, well, this has got to be the Buddha urinating. And it's in that manuscript that I showed you, not the Marco Polo one, but that one from 1638 that's in Zaragoza, Spain. Yeah, there are all kinds. This is just the tiniest little summary of all the legends. It goes on and on. If you're interested in another whole can of worms, it's the Buddha's tooth that's in Kandy. Now that's another huge topic with all other kinds of misinterpretations. And that one is a copy of that, a replica, a sacralized replica of that is in Burma, the Kongmudo, near Sagaing. That's from the 17th century. But there was constant communication between Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, constant. And the great procession that you may have heard about in Kandy with the Hindu gods and the tooth on the elephant that you see pictures of all the time. At the beginning, it was just the Hindu gods, and it took Thai monks to come over and say, hey, you've got a procession, you've got the tooth. Put the tooth in the procession. And it was a Thai idea. But there are all kinds of myths. And the rulers in Burma, Bayanong and his wife, his queen, took their hair, cut it, so to sweep the floor. And there may be some truth to these things. That particular thing was sweeping the floor with the hair. Another hugely popular myth is that the Portuguese stole one of the teeth from Sri Lanka, brought it to Goa, and so the Goans said, oh God, we've got to destroy this, what did they call it? This evil tooth or something like that. And so, and then one governor said, destroy it? Hell no, this is valuable. And so wanted to ransom it to the highest Buddhist bidder. And it could be Burma was in Pegu, Hamsavati. They were the big dynasty at the time. And there was this back and forth. But the tooth was finally destroyed. And they hammered it, and there's a whole mythology associated with it. And but that's another. There's been this whole problem has been studied recently by a very influential Buddhist historian. If you want a book on that, it's just come out. But the relics, it goes on and on. But the kind of interconnection between, you had monks from Sri Lanka, going to Thailand and going back and forth. It was paradoxically, there was more even with Google and WhatsApp and everything else, there was probably more communication, meaningful communication between these various Buddhist countries in Southeast Asia than there is today. But they all regard themselves like Catholic communities in Europe. They regard themselves as the same family, same spiritual family. But there's so many individual differences, like that deity who invited the Buddha, Saman, is completely indigenous and has nothing to do with the Pali Canon or the commentaries, whereas the footprints in Burma and in Thailand emerged completely from the Pali Canon and the commentaries. So that's just one example of how these Asian Buddhist countries are so different. Anyway, I've been doing too much talking. Yes.
We have another question
Yeah,
back there.
sir.
Hi, thank you for such an informative session. I'm just wondering, with so many sort of conflicting claims across religions, also art and also mythology, I'm just wondering, in your research, is there an attempt to try and reconcile that or provide some kind of objectivity across all of that complexity, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Right.
Thanks.
I think I understand the question. If I do, I would say that the difficulty we have in these dichotomies or these compartments, I don't think were considered difficulties. It was all blended. So the political became the religious. But what I think is missing in so many of today's modern interpretations, which give it far too more a political stance, so that you can say, oh, well, they only did this, they only worshiped this or created this temple in order to show their power. That's a common interpretation, or to show their dominance, which is true at one level. But I think what's missing is that in the pre-modern world, that people really believed in merit, and they believed in the consequences of demerits. So if you did something wrong, you paid a price. And so many of the monuments are created for atonement. So kings, usually kings, did something horrible, and often it was patricide. So after killing their father, and then the remorse begins, and then what do? You create a huge temple or a stupa. And that is a constant feature in all of these so-called Theravada Buddhist countries. At Pagan, the Damayanji temple was considered a major, huge, one of the largest temples at Pagan. In later mythology, was considered an act of atonement to create this because of a patricide. And this is true in Thailand, Nakhon Pathom, one of the largest stupas in Thailand. The later mythology is remorse for a patricide and a fratricide. This poor guy killed his father and his brother, so he had a lot to do. So, but people overlook that, and there's been a lot of the people who did create these were true believers. I have no doubt about that, and that's it, and it's still true. The chief monk at one of the major shrines told me, oh, well, these relics that we have, these bones, one night I came in and they floated in the air, uh, and people believe these things, and it's hard for us to accept that. But until we accept it, we can't begin to understand the myths. But with remorse and creating these monuments to atone, they're all in the Buddhist scriptures. And guess who's benefiting the most? The Buddhist community, because they are the receivers, the receptacles for this benevolence. But it goes on and on. But I'd encourage you to go to Sri Lanka. Yeah. And if anybody you want my book, I can send you a PDF so you don't have to buy. I don't get any royalties from this book, so I can send you. Otherwise, you'd have to buy it, but I can send you the PDF.
Okay, I think with that, we've run out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, John, for spending your evening with us
Sure.
and for a really, truly wonderful talk. We hope you all can join us again in the coming 2 weeks as we hold 2 talks of varied topics. On 6th August, ACM has jointly organized a talk with the Asia Research Institute on the topic of Xuanzang and his legacy. Pardon my pronunciation. On 14th August, we will hold a talk on how Chinese garments worn by Han Chinese women found new life in Europe and the US. So we hope to see you back here very soon. Last but not the least, we would really appreciate some feedback on the session. So if you could scan the QR code and just drop us feedback on the feedback form, we'd really appreciate it. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dalio Philanthropies and, of course, Don Stadtner for making this evening possible. Thank you all and have a very good evening.
Good. Thank you.